Today we have a jam-packed schedule of profound presentations led by some fantastic speakers on the topic of systemic racial inequity. Over the last 4 decades or more, there have been laws and policies enacted to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in society as a whole. However, little has changed in over 40 years. From the 70s, where Black Caribbean boys were treated as educationally subnormal, treated in punitive ways and sent to special schools due to their teachers' biases and lack of cultural intelligence, as well as Asian school children being bused to different schools across the country because the London schools were getting too ethnically diverse. To today even, where we see that the largest degree awarding gaps in universities impacts Black students the most. The biases and erasures of the histories, achievements, inventions, and shared stories about heroes of Black and Indigenous people put students from these backgrounds at an unlevel playing field and disadvantage in life, as they are labelled with the stigma that they do not come from greatness, and this is obviously a vehement lie. This perception is not only believed by white students and white people in society, but it's also believed by Black and brown students, as they begin to believe those narratives too, due to the narratives being told by educators and being reinforced by messages from the media. There is a lack of generational wealth, privilege, and positionality that impacts the success of students from Black and Indigenous backgrounds. These privileges give their white counterparts a head start in life and a bubble of protection from injustice and systemic inequity. From education right up to the workplace, Black people are treated in punitive ways and surveillanced due to the biases and narratives set upon them. In order for things to change, we need to get to the root and the crux of the issues. We need to dismantle the systems that perpetuate from the top. Institutional decisions are made by individuals. It is time for us to learn to unlearn our disillusioned ways of thinking and reframe our minds to more truthful and accurate narratives. And with that being said, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, award-winning psychologist and Associate Professor of Education, Dr. Jamelia Blake. And she'll be presenting to you on the adultification of Black girls and its impact into adulthood for Black women.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm delighted to be here. I am going to share my screen. So I want to talk about adultification bias among Black girls and how this impacts Black women. And to do so, I think it's important to recognize that Black girls and women face what I consider to be an educational paradox. So what that means is, in general, at least in the States, what we see is that Black women are touted as being very successful academically. There was recently a media headline that noted that Black women were one of the most educated groups in the United States. And when you pull behind the mask, you find that this is the case when you compare Black women to white women in terms of having some college experience, to a lesser extent having graduated or attained a bachelor's degree. White women still outpace Black women. But in general, the idea amongst society is that Black women are doing well. And in comparison to Black men, they are to a certain extent. But when we dig deeper, what we find is that even though Black women are the most educated of all women, they earn less money. We also find that beyond significant income disparities, Black women face a glass ceiling, and they are also subject to health disparities. And this also mirrors what we see for Black girls in K through 12 educational settings. When we pull the mask back, we know that Black girls, like Black women, are high achieving academically relative to Black boys, but they also struggle with school discipline. And this is true in the UK as well, but this data is from the United States. And what we see is that Black girls are suspended almost 4.5 times more likely than white girls. And this is surprising if you consider the fact that Black girls are high achieving. And when we look into why Black girls might be over disciplined, what we find is that Black girls are disciplined more so for infractions that are subjective. So this graphic, this infographic shows that Black girls are twice as likely as white girls to be suspended for dress code violations using their cell phone in the States. Black girls are also 2.5 times more likely to be suspended for disobedience, or 3 times more likely than disruptive behavior. And these statistics are important because subjective infractions are infractions where that's based on people's values. So what we're finding is that Black girls are suspended not for objective things, but things that can change based on your values. So for example, we all have very different definitions of what it means to be obedient, if you will, or what it means to be defiant. And so this presents a moving target. And this is relevant because when we say, if you will, the kids are all right, or Black girls are doing well, what the field has shown us, and you can see this a lot in popular press, is that actually Black girls are at greater risk for juvenile justice contact, which you wouldn't expect. And we call this the school to prison pipeline. So I present all this information to you as a context to ask you to ponder or consider, when you look at Black girls, or when you think of Black girls, and when you look at Black women as a society, and I'm talking about us as a global society, what do we see? What is it that we see? Do we see these high achieving, well-equipped girls and women? And how do we explain these disparities that they're experiencing? So in essence, are girls, based on the adage, sugar, spice, and everything nice? Or when we think about Black girls, do we see them in a different light? As Abigail noted, systemic racism is pervasive. It's global. It's a global phenomenon, right? And so when we look at, these are just some headlines that I pulled from the United States recently, and I could probably pull 50 of these in the last 5 years of Black girls being treated with law enforcement with excessive force. And again, the question is, if these girls are high achieving, right? And they become these Black women that are high, attaining these elevated educational degrees, then why is it that they're experiencing, these punitive responses? And I believe it is because Black girls are not seen as the children they are, but instead as Black women. And this brings me to the work that I'm going to talk about and define for you, which is adultification bias. But before I do that, it's important to explain the historical stereotypes that are used to describe Black women that is rooted in slavery, because these stereotypes are essentially mapped onto the behaviors of Black girls. So the mammy stereotype, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the mammy stereotype is a stereotype where Black women are seen as completely selfless and serving the needs of everyone but their own. If you're familiar with the caricature of Aunt Jemima, this is usually the person who is acting as the nanny, taking care of everyone, not caring to their own needs. That's their health, their appearance. Everything is about doing what's best for the family, and by extension, if you want to talk about caretaking nannies, white families. The Jezebel is a stereotype that focuses on the hypersexualization of Black women. So the idea that Black women are sexually promiscuous and need to be controlled is what is a Jezebel stereotype. And the Sapphire is a stereotype that really captures the angry Black woman and the hostility. And both the Jezebel and the Sapphire stereotypes are the stereotypes that are most likely associated with the subjective infractions that Black girls are disciplined for. So these are the types of behaviors that educators and adults try to control and minimize because they're mapping these stereotypes on the benign behavior often of Black girls. So if Black girls are actually not seen as girls, but instead as Black women, in that stereotypes are being stereotypes about Black women are being mapped onto their behavior. What I was interested in understanding in this concept of adultification bias is the notion that Black girls are not in fact seen as girls, but instead these racialized stereotypes are used to describe them. And so what I did with some colleagues is we surveyed adults to get their perceptions of Black girls, and we asked them questions about stereotypes about Black women and what we know to be true of childhood. So childhood has certain characteristics, right? A child is supposed to be innocent. They're not supposed to know about certain topics. A child needs protection. You know, childhood is this period of nativity where children are expected to grow and develop and learn, and we as adults in our society are supposed to guide them. So we asked these adults to rate whether Black or white girls at different ages needed support, whether Black or white girls needed to be comforted. We asked them how knowledgeable Black or white girls were about sex, particularly because we wanted to assess whether this hypersexualization stereotype was mapping onto Black girls' behavior. And then we asked them how independent did they feel that Black and white girls were. And what we found was both disheartening and confirmatory, if you will. So this graphic is our results, and I'm going to explain it briefly. So the bottom line, the gray line, is the ratings of how people rated white girls. The 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and 15, 19 are the age groups. And the purple line is how the adults rated Black girls, so how they perceive Black girls. So if you look at the 0 to 4, both dots there, there's no difference, and that's what we would expect. We wouldn't expect that infant racial differences would emerge between infants, right? So that was just kind of a test of, is this a validity test? But what was really disheartening was that as early as 5, adults were seeing Black girls as knowing more about sex, not needing to be comforted, seeing them as independent. And this trend continued until Black girls were early adolescents, if you will. And it still continued into adolescence, but not as much, in that they also saw the differences not being as great between white and Black girls. So what does this mean? So I want us to just sit here for a second with this, if these findings are new to you. So this is actually my daughter when she was 5. She's not 5 anymore. So I want you to take a picture. This is a 5-year-old in all their glory. And if you've ever been around a 5-year-old, this is an accurate depiction of them. This was her playing dress up, lip syncing, right? Completely innocent. The question is, would we expect this 5-year-old to know about sex? Do we not believe that this 5-year-old needs to be comforted, right? Do we not see that this child is impossible or incapable of being independent, right? So this kind of depiction of seeing Black girls as being more adult-like at very young ages is a form of implicit racial bias that impacts Black girls and Black women as they progress throughout their lives. So as a follow-up project, my colleague and I, we interviewed Black women and girls, mainly because we got so much feedback from Black women that said, oh my gosh, you have characterized my entire life with this adultification bias. I never have been able to explain it, but this is what I've gone through, where people just assumed that I was older or acting like an adult, and I wasn't given the benefit of a doubt. So we interviewed Black women and girls to get their perspective and for them to explain what adultification bias feels like and looks like. And I won't spend a lot of time here. I'll allow the audience to read this. But some of the themes that emerged that aligned with the quantitative aspect of my work is this idea that Black girls were not extended empathy. It was as if that when Black girls were vulnerable and crying, that was not seen as a sincere form of emotional expression. So their tears did not have the same value as that of white girls. There was also a theme that was the weaponizing of any type of benign behavior as being oppositional and seeing Black girls as having an attitude. So Black girls were always presented with challenging authority. Even we often see this with questioning. So oftentimes the Black women would talk about how their daughters or when they were young, they would question to understand, question for clarification. And that questioning was seen as challenging authority as opposed to a very higher order critical thinking skill that's important for educational attainment. And finally, a theme that continued to emerge was that Black girls were not allowed to just make mistakes. They were constantly held to another standard that was beyond their developmental age. So it is this adultification bias resulted in authority figures in their lives treating them like adults in the sense that they should know how to respond and what to do. And finally, they were not allowed to be their free self, which is being a child in all of their fullness. Because of this adultification bias and these unreasonable expectations set upon them that were not developmentally consistent with their age, they had an additional burden that other girls who were not Black experienced. So what does this mean? I gave you a lot of information. Simply put, adultification bias is a form of implicit racial bias. It's an act of dehumanization. We all can agree that childhood is, even though childhood is a social construct, that childhood is a normative part of our developmental process. And so when you strip an aspect of development from one racial group and afford another racial group that option, you essentially are dehumanizing Black girls. It's also an example of anti-Blackness. And because these stereotypes that we've internalized, we've all internalized these stereotypes about Black women and also Black men, it's pervasive because it's a form of systemic racism. It's embedded within our societies, it's embedded within us. And we saw this not only in based on the number of people we surveyed, but just based on the different educational levels, socioeconomic status, and racial ethnic background. It was persistent across all of those different backgrounds. So what does this mean? You know, why talk about adultification bias related to Black girls? And why I think this is important is because of how this bias manifests itself in the K through 12 educational context, right? So Black girls who are subject to adultification bias are held to higher developmental standards. And what that means is that the bar is set so high that it's difficult for them to ever meet the expectations because they're not being held to the standards that's appropriate for their age. And that can be self-defeating. Adultification bias also means that benign behaviors, everything that Black girls do is seen as oppositional or threatening. So in those media headlines that I showed you where police were responding incredibly punitively and violently to Black girls for benign behaviors, that's a function of that adultification bias. You're treating those girls not the way you would treat children. We tend to treat children with kid gloves, if you will, and we're careful and we're thoughtful because we know that they're developing and growing. But if you don't see Black girls as being children, if you see them as being adult, you're not going to have that same level of sensitivity. What also happens, and the literature talks about this, my experience working with Black girls, my own daughters talk about this, is Black girls are constantly under surveillance. And what that means is that adults are frequently monitoring their behavior, what they say, how they dress, because they're guided by this stereotype of this bias that their behavior is somehow volitional. My daughter tells me all the time, "Ma, can I live? Can I live? Can I just be?" And it's almost as if they're waiting to catch me do something bad. And she alerts me all the time, like, if you look hard enough and if you're always paying attention to me, of course you're going to catch me doing something bad, right? So this surveillance, this hyper surveillance, it really puts girls on the defense. It makes them very self-conscious, and it doesn't allow for an inclusive environment. And more importantly, adultification bias damages student-teacher relationships because you're not looking at these girls as children. You're looking at them, if you will, as, to a certain extent, a peer. And so there's a lack of trust that you have for them, and the girls in turn have a lack of trust because you're not seeing them as individuals. So how does adultification impact Black women? Well, simply put, Black girls become Black women who become, some of us, Black mothers. And just like I've talked about us internalizing these racialized stereotypes about Black women, we also internalize this adultification bias. And it manifests itself in two different ways. One is the hypersexualization, right? So if you are always seen as being older, if you're seen as being more adult-like, if you're seen as being very sexy, there's some women who start to embody that hypersexualization and believe that that is characteristic of what Black women should be and how they should display themselves, right? So they accept that. But more importantly, when you're constantly seen as being adult-like, and I call it the burden of competence, you're seen as being more competent than other people, then you internalize this mammy stereotypes, or the sojourner syndrome, as I like to call it. And this is where Black women take responsibility, both in their personal lives and their work lives, for everyone and everything at the expense of their own health, emotional, and physical well-being. And this is something that they are socialized to do as a result of adultification bias. They internalize it, but it's also a function of society placing that burden. And in response to this internalization, Black women develop maladaptive coping strategies. There's this double taxation that Black women experience, both emotionally and cognitively, from being seen as more competent, more adult-like, and having more responsibility placed on them, where they're both trying to minimize stereotypes. So you have Black women in the professional world who are constantly aware of these stereotypes and they're monitoring their behavior. They're trying not to, look too sexual or look too professional, or they are taking on everything and every task because it's expected of them. And my favorite author, Toni Morrison, says this much more eloquently than I ever will, but all of these things are a manifestation of racism, and racism is a distraction, and distractions impede your ability to be successful, whether that be academically or professionally, because you're cognitively distracted and emotionally distracted by these forces or by this system that is undermining your potential. In addition to what's happening to Black women internally, I believe adultification bias, because of it, Black women are not afforded the same level of grace. The same thing that Black girls talked about is more responsibility, and often unreasonable expectations are placed on them because they can handle it, because they're tough. They're not expected to be vulnerable, and they're not. And when they make mistakes, it's handled in the higher education and the work environment more punitively. Black women are also seen as being very hostile when they're meant to be assertive. And just like Black girls, they're constantly under surveillance and scrutiny. And the surveillance comes in the form of microaggressions, the monitoring of what Black women are wearing and how they're speaking and how they're presenting their ideas. And all of this creates this storm where we know this, and we can see this actually in the data, where Black women are facing barriers to their advancements in their careers, right? And so adultification bias has these residual effects on Black women that I think many Black women are not even aware of, because it's something that we have, and I say we because I identify as a Black woman, it is something that we have had to grapple with, and our mothers have had to grapple with for much of our lives. So it's so pervasive that we don't even realize either that we're internalizing these stereotypes or the impact it's having on us. So in the essence of time, I'd like to wrap up, but I'm happy to take questions at the end of the panel. But so what are the calls for action? Where do we go from here? So I've defined adultification bias, and it was wonderful to hear Abigail's introduction because we did not plan this, but I really believe that we need to look at root causes for the educational and employment disparities that we see. And what I mean by root causes is it's not enough to say that Black people are not reaching the same level of educational attainment as individuals from other ethnicities, or it's not enough to say that Black people are not being paid the same wages. Like we know this, there's significant data, but we need to drill down and understand why. We need to detect, is this about implicit racial bias? Is this about, sexism? We need to drill down and identify the mechanisms. Is it adultification bias that's shaping the way that the opportunities or lack of opportunities that are provided for Black people? My second call of action is that we need to do education and training on anti-Blackness and intersectionality, very much like this one. But as a professor in higher education, what I notice and know about the institutions that I've been affiliated with is that we like to do these one and done diversity trainings or seminars, but if we're really going to combat anti-Blackness and we're going to dismantle structural racism, then we need to run the marathon. These need to be ongoing, very well thought out, continuous trainings that address these issues. Oftentimes Black people suffer from racial battle fatigue because they're constantly combating racism and discrimination in their everyday life. And that's because they're marathon runners, if you will. And people who are not of color are not used to having to have these dialogues and conversations. So I've had many colleagues tell me, well, I'm tired of talking about this. And I said, well, you're tired of talking about this. We only went to 2 sessions, right? So we need to be thinking about this for the long haul. It's not just, we did 1 session, we talked about it, problem is solved. It took hundreds of years to establish this system. It's going to take longer than 1 or 2 sessions to dismantle it. And then finally, trainings are wonderful, education is wonderful, but none of it makes sense without integrated action plans that can be sustained and systemic. So what I mean by that is, for higher education institutions, it's not enough to just offer a training. And it's not enough to write a commitment to diversity or a commitment to inclusion. That and often happens at the states. It's more important for you to think about, okay, how are we going to address anti-Blackness in our curriculum, right? So there's, in California, in the United States, There are universities that are requiring students to take ethnic studies and social justice courses, and multiple courses, not just one courses, right? When we talk about policy, let's not just focus on admissions and retention, but let's focus on every aspect, how we're hiring faculty, how we're hiring staff, how is our decision making influence at the upper level administration level to dismantle racism. And then finally, service delivery, which is something we do really good in higher ed, which is programming. We tend to spend a lot of time programming just to one segment of the population, but our programs need to be inclusive. We still need that very focused programming that focuses on minority people or people of color who are disenfranchised, but we also need programming that lets the entire university institution understand that we're targeting anti-Blackness. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much for such a profound presentation. Jamelia, you've given us exclusive insight into the lives and experiences of Black women and what they go through. Not a lot of people know what we do experience in our daily lives. And we do have quite a few questions that have come in. I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer them all, but we will be answering them just after the next session. The next session is actually being held by Rotimi Akinsete. He's the Associate Dean of Students at the University of the Arts London, and he's also the founder of Black Men on the Couch. And he'll be presenting to you today, My History is My Skin, revisiting racial trauma amongst Black men and boys and the impact it has on mental health.
Hi there. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Abigail, and thank you and the team also as well for inviting me to this very, very important conference/seminar. Thanks also as well to Jamila for her presentation. Very, very enlightening, especially for me with a 13-year-old daughter. I particularly liked also as well the photographs and the images that you had on there, really brilliant. Okay. As said, my name is Mr. Rotimi Akinsete. I'm the Associate Dean of Students at the University of the Arts, London. I'm going to give a very short presentation with some focus on mental health and well-being of Black men. I'll refer to transgenerational trauma and fatigue, and we'll, towards the end, talk a little bit about what can be done and what is being done. Some of what Jamila's already said will be repeated, and I'm sure throughout the afternoon there'll be some reference to some of the things that I've said, and I'll be referring to some of what's going to be said already. Okay, let me share on my screen and start the presentation. Right, okay, so a little bit of context. I could have renamed this My History is in My Skin, Revisiting Racial Trauma Amongst Black Boys and Men in the Wake of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, and Brexit as well, because much of what I'm going to say is located in the current time, but obviously there is a historical perspective. I've included this page here because James Brown is one of my favorite artists, the godfather of soul, produced a record in 1973 called Mind Power. Now, this would be one of my favorite records because of the title, but also as well because the record starts with these words here. You know, we're dealing with a very crucial and critical time, most critical and crucial time that I've ever witnessed. Now, this definitely relates to today, but when James said that he was talking about the civil rights movement, and particularly in the early 70s, with mass unemployment in the United States of America, he was intent in getting the word out that Black men need jobs. These words seem ever so critical now, as said, because we're still in Brexit, we're still in COVID-19 and lockdown, and Black Lives Matter has played a significant role in how people are talking about and understanding what racism is. What's extraordinary about these times at the moment is that protests around the world over the last few months have revealed two things. One, that black men do cry, obviously. And I put these pictures here because in all the time that I've been a psychotherapist and practically in all of my life, I cannot remember witnessing the number of black men that I know personally and in the public eye that have been left in tears, particularly around the current situation. It's the strangest thing. I mean, I can't get my head around it. Top picture, John Boyega, actor in Star Wars, here at one of the marches in London, saying a lot about the situation in which he finds himself in, and was drawn to tears. It was an extraordinary thing to witness. Bottom left, Ashley Walters, actor. He released a video to respond to criticism from people online on social media that was saying he was not talking into what's going on with Black Lives Matter. As he was talking and explaining himself and referring to a time when he was racially attacked and left for dead some years ago, he burst into tears. Extraordinary thing to see. On the bottom right, you may know Kanye West and you may love or loathe him. He's announced very, very recently that he's going to be going for president of the United States of America, an extraordinary thing to do. But a couple of days ago in his opening talk, he burst into tears. Now, there's been so much discussion about what's going on with him at the moment, you know, whether he's suffering a mental health breakdown and all sorts, but here he is anyway, openly, you know, in tears, showing his emotion. As I say, I mean, it's an extraordinary time. I can't remember another time when I've seen so many strong black men in the public eye showing their emotions at this time. The second thing that this time is revealing is that to many of us, particularly those of you who are white, have found something really hard to confess, that there is an ongoing pandemic called racism. While we deny it, this pandemic remains more sinister and deadly than any virus. It hides itself deep inside people and long, long ago leapt from people into systems, into the structures of society, including universities. I believe that there is a willingness in principle, but not in practice, to tackle racism, increase representation, and genuinely work to achieve greater sense of belonging for Black, Asian, minority ethnic people of color, non-white people in university and society. And thus, sadly, progress in trying to do something about it is very, very slow. Now, please forgive me for putting up this working definition of racism. Some people still don't get it, so I think I have to put this up. Those of us who know about this stuff already, I'm sorry if I'm preaching to the converted, but we just need to repeat and state what it is that we understand as racism to be, particularly in this moment, because some people's eyes are only just being opened, it would seem. But as it says here, racism is the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to physical appearance and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. This was taken from Wikipedia, so very, very recently, this definition. Now, I've posted this here because, well, I mean, trying to explain racism and what it means and how it developed would take several hours, and I haven't got that amount of time. But this is a tweet from a friend and colleague, Karen Minkin, who tweeted this morning. And I'll just quickly read this out. What she said is, as I understand it, since slavery, the main threat to white patriarchy was the strength and pride of the Black man. They had to be violently destroyed. And now half the world, especially America, cannot seem to recover from that. It is sickening. That's where we are at this time in relation to race. She had one response by the time I copied this from someone called Charlene Robinson. And she says, it is, as is the sexual objectification of Black women, somewhat alluded to our previous talk. It says here, reduced to body parts without a brain and repeatedly dismissed and disregarded. The white patriarchy does not want Black women to have power. So in some ways, we're already seeing the practical application of racism through the ages right up until the present day. Another definition. I do apologize to those who are already aware, and apologize for preaching to the converted. But this is about institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, which is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization, leading to issues as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, amongst other issues. Now, people would have heard this term before, obviously. During the murder of, or at the time of the murder of Stephen Lawrence in '93, the police didn't give that murder much attention, and it was declared institutionally racist by the Macpherson report in 1999. I remember this poignantly because I was working at the University of Greenwich at the time, and literally that was just half a mile away from where Stephen fell. Since then, stop and search by police is still 8 times more likely to target Black people in spite of laws banning racial discrimination and in spite of the Macpherson report deeming the police institutionally racist. Now, complicity is worth considering, I think. I mean, over the last couple of months, I've attended many seminars, many talks, many presentations. I've spoken to lots of people, have had loads of questions from Black and white friends. And invariably, discussions end up with, we ought to give due consideration to how we are complicit in the situation in which we find ourselves in. And I say this a lot to my white colleagues and friends when they ask, what is it that I should be doing? Think a little about the place that you play in society and the place that you play in doing something about or not racism as we find it. One significant question somebody asked white people the other day is, just check your own history. Those of you who are British, double check and see whether you have ancestors or people going not that far back who were slave traders or who benefited from the slave trade. You may well be surprised about how complicit even your own family is. Complicity is an important part for us to think about when we're thinking about what we may or may not do about the situation. Amity Doku is a Cambridge graduate and he was a deputy president of the NUS. And he, in a recent talk, says that universities also as well have to consider their own complicity. Universities, he says, are inextricably linked with the creation of race as a concept, which is an interesting thing to consider. He says the sector produced academics and thinkers who created racial hierarchies, and these hierarchies provided the intellectual underpinning for colonialism and slavery. What a thing for an institution to consider. All of us who work or are in institutions, higher education institutions at the moment, will know and will have sensed and seen what's happened since Black Lives Matter in the last couple of months or so. Many institutions have written well-meaning statements, but many institutions have had so much pushback from staff, students, and alumni that we are not doing enough. Maybe the story is that we need to start from a where are we complicit point of view and then work our way backwards from there. I'm afraid I've got a couple more definitions for you. Trauma is so much part of our everyday vocabulary nowadays. For counselors and psychotherapists like myself, the world all over, we describe trauma as an event or series of events that have had life-changing effects on an individual or group. It's important for us to consider transgenerational trauma when we're talking about race and racism. Dr. Eileen Allain, a well-respected person in psychotherapeutic tradition, describes transgenerational trauma as something that impacts multiple generations over centuries. It is historical and contains ancestral baggage that is the transgenerational transmission of trauma, which becomes part of the psyche. In other words, people of African descent across the world today are affected by the trauma of many, many years ago during the advent of colonialism, followed by the Atlantic slave trade. If we accept that, then it's worth having a look at the impact of transgenerational trauma and institutional racism on society. I'll just quickly skim through these. Just examples, going back a few years and some of them in present day. 21% of black children feel their skin color will make it harder for them to succeed in the future. Young black people in the UK face an unemployment rate of close to 45%, and that's considerable, particularly considering the financial times that we are about to enter. There are a disproportionate number of black and minority men held in UK prisons, and you can find the same in the United States. In the first 3 months of 2013, going a bit back, the number of African Caribbean inmates in youth offender institutions and secure centres and children's homes rose by 10.4%, while their white counterparts, it fell by 42%. A large number of black youth between 11 and 16 years are at risk of being hurt or killed because of gang warfare, and we hear examples of this every single day. 10 years ago, over 50% of black 7-year-olds were living in poverty. Looking at the impact in the educational context, many of us will know, particularly those of us that work in higher education, that a large number of black boys, as compared to their white peers, are placed in isolation at school. Lots of schools in London are reporting that black kids, black boys, have been placed in isolation because they've come to school with the wrong haircut. That's amazing to hear that sort of thing happening in this day and age. Black pupils are 3 times more likely than any other groups, except Gypsy and traveller communities, to be permanently excluded from school. If we know that education really is the way forward for society, then exclusion from school is going to get you nowhere as a black person. In higher education, universities are showing an average of 26% attainment gap. This is incredible, to think that you will come to university and that you have a considerable chance of not attaining a degree at the same level as your white counterpart. My daughter's 13 years old. If she considers to go to university in 5 or 6 years' time, I'm going to have to sit her down and tell her that there is this considerable risk that you may not do well, given the way that higher education is at the moment. There are low continuation rates at universities. In universities, there is a very Eurocentric curriculum, so much that we've been trying to teach you as our daughter in our home every day about the black experience is going to be of no use when you get to university, because the curriculum does not take into account your own experience. What you'll find, I'll be saying to her, is that there are very few black professors in higher education institutions. There are thousands of professors in this country, but we literally have something like 85 non-white professors in this country out of, I don't know what it is, 17,000? If you want to challenge me on this, please do. But it's considerable. When black youngsters get to university, there's a lack of a sense of belonging. That's what they've reported. There's inadequate racial harassment reporting structures, and there are few black senior leaders in the sector. Today in 2020, this is incredible. And this is the sort of thing that parents are having to sit down and tell their children before they sign up for university in this day and age. So, what to do? Key principles in tackling racial inequalities. There's a list here, and I've collected this list over the last couple of months at very many seminars and talks that I've been in. So some of this you would have seen before and already. We need to give due consideration to centering black students and staff experiences when implementing solutions. In other words, don't dare think that you can start to tackle racism in higher education without including the thoughts and experiences of black students and staff. It can't happen. An institutional-wide and coordinated approach has to happen. It cannot just be focused in the academy and say in the curriculum. We also as well have to think of the central services, whether it be HR, student support services, the estates, a whole university approach that includes everyone in the university, from students and staff. Source appropriate expertise. There's lots of expertise in higher education. There's also as well lots of expertise outside. Bring them in, just like what's happening here at this conference today. Create key principles when tackling racial inequalities. Lots of universities are talking about this at the moment. This will also include developing racial, anti-racist strategies. Resource effectively. Money has to be put aside for this. It has. Otherwise, we'll just continue to replicate the status quo. There needs to be graduate schemes for progression into university professional services, and I think some of this will be discussed later on in other talks. Sector-wide BME graduate schemes and campaigns for progression to postgraduate courses. This has to happen. We need more Black people studying at doctorate level, and then hopefully going on to readership and professorial level as well. It has to happen, has to be increased. To quickly go on, accredited HE, race equality, continuing personal development programs. We have to explore sector-wide recommendations, and there are several, especially now. We have to look at equity agreements with key providers in HE, and we have to be and allow for creativity within higher education institutions. Many people have got many, many very, very good ideas, and they have to be heard. A couple of examples. Here's one of centering Black students and staff experience and when implementing solutions. This is a piece of research that I did alongside Dr. Douglas Grafida at the University of Rochester in New York in September 2018. The results of this research was published in the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy University and Colleges Journal. What we found when we were making a comparative analysis of universities in the United States and the universities here is that Black male failure and lack of attainment can be partly explained by the fact that many Black male students at predominantly white institutions set up and actively participate in societies to combat racism. This places them at a disadvantage in a number of ways. With the academy, some academics see that as a threat, and also as well see that the individual as a threat and then mark him or her down. But also as well, lots of Black students who are actively organizing on campus find, which has already been referred to in previous talk, that they have battle fatigue. More time is being spent on battling anti-racism than on their studies. And that is only going to result in failure. So we have to center these sorts of experiences in trying to find solutions, working with those students to help them to, one, be active enough, because that is partly our role in institutions, and to change things, but also as well be active enough in their studies. Moving swiftly on, and I'm coming to the end. Here's another example of, or here is an example of a possible key principle, and this is one provided by my colleague at the University of the Arts London, Lucy Panasar, who's a colleague, but also as well a PhD student, and I did ask her whether I can share this, and she was happy for me to do that. Lucy states that amongst university staff, there are concerns that targeting and or positive action is illegal, that it will single out students as being deficit and that students don't want to be targeted. What Lucy says is that universities are advised that targeting in the form of positive action is lawful under the Equality Act 2010 to, quote, alleviate disadvantaged experienced by people who share a protected characteristic or reduce underrepresentation in relation to particular activities or meet particular needs. To quote just a little bit more, if I may, Section 158 of the Equality Act permits an institution to treat a group differently with reference to protected characteristics, where the aim is to tackle inequality of opportunity stemming from past or present discrimination. Therefore, positive action is legal if the three conditions of proportionality, disadvantage, and need are met. And if universities are unsure about this, they are advised to seek legal guidance. In other words, universities should be giving due consideration to creating key principles based on positive action for non-white students. It has to happen. A last example about what can be done is Black Man on a Couch. Those of you who might know me will know that this is an initiative I set up in 2011 rather. In 2001, I completed my master's and realized that there were not enough Black men considering psychotherapy and counseling as a profession or entering psychotherapy to help solve their issues and concerns. So what I did is I set up a series of events, public events, where I interviewed, using counseling skills, Black men in the public eye to talk about their own challenges and successes. Here you'll see on the top left, Ashley Walters, the actor. We've got a couple of footballers. I've got Craig here, and I've done Stan Collymore. On the right, you've got Colin Jackson, Benjamin Zephaniah, bottom left, Trevor Phillips, who works with and around equalities, the bottom middle, and most recent was the Kwame Kwei-Armah, who is the ex-chancellor of the University of the Arts in London. Now, I've held this in a couple of universities, the universities that I've worked in, but a number of universities across the country, from Scotland down to the UK. These are just creative ways of getting the message out about what we can and should do about combating racism, but also as well talking to people in the public eye who have been affected by it and sharing their experiences as to how to meet what's going on for them and how to manage what's going on for them. So this is just my attempt at saying to institutions, we need to be more creative about doing something about the situation in which we find ourselves in higher education. So that was my my whistle stop tour. Let me just stop sharing my screen. Right, yeah, so that's me done. Sorry, it was short and sweet. I do understand there are a number of questions in the question box, and I'm assuming that Abigail and others will ask that of us, but I'm open to take any questions now. Thanks, Annabelle.
Hi, thank you very much, Rotimi, for another very enlightening presentation on the mental health of Black men and boys, an insight into their lives and mindsets that many people would not be aware of, because, you know, we do tend to exhibit strength and resilience, and sometimes that can be seen as, you know, we don't feel pain or we don't get emotional and we don't get hurt, which is obviously untrue. We're all human and we feel the same emotions, and we are impacted and affected by these daily racial, I would say, microaggressions, but also straight up aggressions as well. But thank you. If you could answer questions in the Q&A box, please, because we are constrained for time. So we will go to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Tejas Rawal, who completed his MA in Dramaturgy at the Central School of Speech and Drama, and he's also a Brunel alumni. He studied theatre and drama.
Yeah.
And he's going to present on whiteness in social movements, which is a research endeavour.
Thanks.
Take it away.
Hiya. To start with, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Abigail for making today happen and giving me the opportunity to share this space with the important perspectives we're hearing. As recent events have emphasised, the facilitation of spaces like this is increasingly necessary and urgent, and I hope my talk in some way emphasises that. Research, as it is framed and functions in the Western University, is a highly extractive exercise, be that intangible resources like time and money, or, and no less significant, mental and emotional stamina. By now, it is clear to us all that the costs and sacrifices of this extraction are not shared equally by all our peers. When the intersections of race, socioeconomic position, gender, sexuality, and disability are finally accepted as fundamental considerations in our critique of the university, the spaces we inhabit are rendered depressingly more clear as forms of inequity and exclusion, the inhabitation of which comes at great psychological and capital cost to those of us who grapple with the societal challenges resultant of our identities. In recent years, I, as a student researcher, have witnessed a bizarre trend within the institutions I've been affiliated with, whereby instead of seeking to tackle and dismantle exclusionary modes of operation, Black and other racialized students have been superficially valorized and exalted for navigating hostile and exclusionary spaces by the very same powers that facilitate this exclusion. While yes, this ability in the face of hostility is awe-inspiring, it's not why we came to the university, to sacrifice our time and energy to engage in spaces that only reluctantly permit our presence, evident in the low attrition rates of Black and ethnic minority students across all disciplines, and the disproportionate mental health challenges faced by these students. Dr. Muna Abdi's words come to mind when she says, instead of praising people for being resilient, change the systems that are making them vulnerable, a notion that I request you keep in mind through this brief presentation and beyond. I completed my master's degree with a research project critiquing the functioning of whiteness and its component exclusionary behaviours in the British climate activist group Extinction Rebellion, While my findings in this study could make a lengthy lecture series in and of themselves, the prevalence of exclusionary practices and behaviours in seemingly progressive movements is well documented. What interests me now, and frames the gist of my contribution to the general topic of today's discussion, is the experience of researching whiteness within the context of the university, which, like the protest group I was researching, is also a seemingly progressive space, which unfortunately is still constructed around systems of exclusion and hostility towards Black and other racialized identities, bodies of knowledge and perspectives. This persists even in the largely liberal and progressive world of performance studies, in which my practice is situated. I undertook my master's degree at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, an institution which, as the very name suggests, has been mired in confronting its own past and present persistence of racism and exclusionary behaviour. My research worked from the basis of looking at Extinction Rebellion as a performance, and I, as a performer audience member, within the paradigm of their public engagement and internal organisation. With this in mind, I engaged with their literature and the on-the-ground dynamics of their methods as a script, the actions of their core leadership as directorial notes, and my own affective response as a subjective individual within the collective as a register through which to articulate my critical reception of the organisation. With an assessment of these areas, particularly centering my own audience response as a person of colour, I attempted to ascertain and then articulate the presence of exclusionary practices, particularly those that related to whiteness within the organisation. This approach often led to the usual throwaway, pacifying, empty apologies. I'm sorry if that's how you feel. I'm sorry if that's how you've perceived what we're doing. Extinction Rebellion prides itself on its seemingly decentralised structure. This decentralisation allows it to forego responsibility for the often racist actions of some members as the works of a fringe group, without mentioning the leadership openly expressing racist beliefs. The experience felt like racial gaslighting at its finest. While members of academic staff at my institution were supportive of my endeavours, I was met with criticism that my methodology, in its centering of personal affect, did not comprehensively acknowledge and function properly within a recognised critical framework. A framework consisting of thinkers like Mark Fisher, Judith Butler, Foucault, Deleuze, Reed White framework. While the work and contributions of these thinkers is undoubtedly significant, it felt uncomfortable to frame and anchor my methodology in this way, at the very same time as critiquing Extinction Rebellion as functioning from a basis of white Western philosophical ideals, such as the Lockean notion of the social contract as only now being broken in the face of the climate crisis, as if it hadn't been broken from its very inception for peoples from the global south. While I was working through my notes, my challenges were further exacerbated when engaging with white peers who were also researching in the area of racial justice and being praised for objectivity in their approaches. In this construction of objectivity, I read a lack of lived experience, and thus material that was less imbued with the realities of personal trauma. It felt as though, while I was being gaslighted in my engagement with Extinction Rebellion, the institutional structures within which I was operating were in themselves defined by a systemic sort of gaslighting, where credit required homage to an academic body which held white thoughts and sensibility supreme. A precursor to successful critique seemed to be working within the nebulous constraints provided for in white Western academia. It was as though I was witnessing whiteness reifying its construction as an unmarked position, all this at the cost of my mental health and consequently my confidence and the quality of my work. Looking for a way to bridge this gap, while feeling I shouldn't have to, I rudimentally Googled philosophy by Black and brown people and came across the work of the Jamaican philosopher Charles W. Mills, who dismantles the myth of contractarianism in his book, The Racial Contract. A line of reasoning which, in its recognition of the positionality of the writer as a Black man, gave an initial sense of validity in my own approach, in recognising my undeniable positionality as a person of colour in my work. Building on this notion, I came across the proposition of Yasmin Gunaratnam, who is a sociologist, of employing radical reflexivity in research, which rightly identifies research as a process of producing rather than simply reflecting what we are researching. In its acknowledgement that both researchers and the subject of research are situated in complex sociological webs of identity, It allows us to recognize our positions as people of color and our validity in the university. The endeavor of seeking out these and other Black and racialized thinkers bolstered and empowered my approach, and I found myself creating a theoretical framework which recognized Black and racialized perspectives. But this came with its own challenges. In finding a sense of community and solidarity with Black and other racialized scholars, I experienced a dual and contradictory effect on my mental health, both a sense of validation and solidarity in my approach, but conversely, a deep sense of disillusionment with my institution. While voices and bodies of knowledge like those I sought and needed were readily out there at the click of a finger, the institution instead promoted white voices and white critical thought, which as an aside, were often not financially affordable to acquire. This sense of disillusionment was only expounded by the reality that the subject of my research, based around the cause for climate justice, which I totally endorse, actively functioned to exclude people like me. My research process made me deeply depressed. Both within the wider university, where in my course I was the only diasporic person of colour, and within the context of my research, I felt a profound sense of isolation, which impacted both my academic progress and my general mental health. Mental health challenges which I did not feel I had the resources nor the time to deal with in healthy ways. When Abigail approached me about speaking today, I was asked to propose 3 actionable steps with my research experience in mind. I've come up with these 3, which also have wider implications when thoroughly considered. I'm just going to share them on my screen. One sec. I don't know if you can see these, Abigail. Can you see these?
Yes, we can see recommendations.
Sure. So the first is mandatory training and awareness of radical reflexivity for researchers in all humanities-based subjects, moving away from a tradition of constructed objectivity which obfuscates the operative mode of whiteness. The second is more stringent and ethics and safeguarding measures for researchers examining racism. This should entail both the facilitation of networks of academic support, solidarity, and peer review from other Black and ethnic minority researchers. With this in mind, I propose that we also allocate funding and the allocation of time for tailored mental health support for Black and other racialized researchers and academics working in areas around racism, should they need it. Despite the persistence of all white reading lists, majority white faculties, copious white hostility and fragility displayed in the face of the strong and ever-growing calls to change, voices and perspectives similar to those I'm sharing this space with today are out there. The ongoing challenge is, much of the onus on seeking and including these voices in our learning is put on Black and other racialized students, an onus which can frankly be emotionally taxing and should be the responsibility of the institutions in which we belong. Our institutions are meant to serve our betterment. We are entitled to space and the necessary accommodations to make these spaces, ones in which diverse thought is allowed to thrive. Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Yes, thank you very much, Tejaz, for that presentation and sharing your vulnerability and the ways in which your mental health was impacted within a space that wasn't set up and wasn't built up for people like us. Due to time constraints, again, I will say that the Q&A will be left to the box for people to ask questions and for our panelists to answer. And we'll have to get straight into our next presenter, who is Agogo Sophie Akpara. She's a final year student in biomedical health and life sciences, and she's also a Black Studies graduate. And she'll be presenting on the need for Black studies in the modern world.
Hello everybody, my name is Agogo, and I want to say firstly thank you to Abigail for the lovely invitation to speak today, and thank you to all the other speakers who have done an amazing job. Today I will be briefly presenting on the need for Black studies in the modern world, so I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. So I am a Black Studies graduate. I took the first Black Studies module to occur in Ireland, and it was an amazing experience. So today I'm going to talk about why I believe that all people, and especially students, need to make sure that they try to educate themselves on Black Studies, and why it is necessary for the world we're living in today, especially. So my experience with Black Studies is going to be the first thing I speak about, and I'm going to speak about what I learned during this module. So first of all, the reason why I took the module in the first place is because I realized that I had not been educated on things to do with Black Studies or with Black history throughout the time of my education. And throughout 15 years, I had maybe received 15 minutes of education of things regarding people who looked like me, or things regarding people who sounded like me or were from the same places that I was. I would maybe hear glimpses here and there of perhaps Nelson Mandela or Kofi Annan, or slavery, apartheid. That was the most I would ever hear of figures that were in history that were Black. And I didn't realize the effect that this had on the way I view education, and on myself, the way I viewed myself. And so when I took this Black Studies module, the first thing that I realized I had to do was, ironically, engage in the activity of unlearning. And I highly recommend that everybody here should try to take part in this, in unlearning the current ways that you think in, because of these things can affect your everyday life and you wouldn't even realize it. So I didn't realize that I had some unconscious bias in me, even though I'm a Black person myself, and that is because of the way I have been sat in the classroom throughout my whole life. My teacher for this module, my professor, was actually a Black woman, and that was the first time I had ever been taught by a Black person in my lifetime. So I had a lot of unlearning to do, and it was very interesting to say the least, but I am so glad that I decided to engage in it. And one of the main things that I learned within this module was the whitewashing of school curriculums and the effects that this has on people. And when I say the whitewashing of school curriculums, I essentially mean how we are taught in primary school, secondary school, higher education, that essentially whiteness is equal to success. And that we are kind of taught a white history. The only times I remembered hearing of anybody of color or of history of color or things like that was to do with negative things like apartheid, like slavery, or else maybe a lesson or two on the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, but nothing that would encourage me now, or nothing that would push me to aim to achieve more. And essentially, there's a quote that I like by Carter G. Woodson, who is the founder of Black History Week, now Black History Month. And I have his book here. It's from the book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And what he says is this: there would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom. Why not exploit, enslave, or exterminate a class that everybody is taught to regard as inferior? And I think that's something that we should all really reflect on, because it's very true what he's saying here. There would be no violent acts of racism, or even the normal acts of racism that we see, if it was not first taught in the classroom. And obviously nobody in this classroom is telling you to be a racist or to act in these type of demeaning ways. However, the way you teach a child, and basically what you teach them, will determine the lens through which they view society and the lens through which they view others. If you teach everybody in a schoolroom or in any sort of class setting that the people who are in the highest positions of power and who are capable of being in the highest positions of power all look a certain way, and everybody else is in low positions of power, it's going to make those people believe that that's the standard for society, and that's the way things are meant to be. So younger Black children will grow up not realizing that they are essentially, they have a bias in their head against themselves. There's either two outcomes that can come about it. I essentially say one person can say, okay, I'm going to rise above this, and I'm going to make sure that I am the first to achieve something. But the majority of people will go with the second option, which is sitting back and saying, if nobody like me is in this position, there's no point in me trying to enter that position either. And this has detrimental effects on children of color, and also even on white people too, and white children as well, because if they then see others who do not look like them as lesser. And all of these people will be people who will grow up one day and jump into positions of power and jump into places where they can have impact. And if they are taught this way from young, it will continue. And the issue that we have today, we will continue to see it for generations upon generations. So we thus have a need to improve the representation that we see in the classroom and the representation that we see in the educational curriculums and systems, because if not, these are the types of effects that we're going to keep on seeing. And another thing that I learned even in regards to this was the power of language. And an example I'm going to use is the word slaves versus enslaved people. So these two words, they essentially convey the same thing. However, there are differences. When you say a slave, you are basically confining a person to what they have been put under. So you're confining a person that they are only able to perform in this way. You're basically confining their entire humanity to the fact that they were a slave. But when you say enslaved people, you are introducing different dimensions into something that seems quite simple. One, you are introducing the fact that they are people, first of all. You are giving them personhood. You are giving them humanity. And this may not seem like it is anything crazy, but it makes a big difference. So you are giving them personhood. Two, you are, like the word enslave conveys that somebody else did this to them. It is not that they were born to be a slave. It was not that they were born and they are inherently going to carry out these things, but no, somebody else subjected them to these positions. And lastly, it shows that they were enslaved during their lifetime, so they had to do tasks without their, like, not according to their will, essentially. And when you even just using that term instead of slaves, it has an impact on the way we see people. It has an impact on the way I look back on my history and say, oh, so my people, the people that looked like me were actually people. They were not just this piece of history. They were not just these people that were treated badly. No, they were actually people who had mind, who had thought, who had intellect and everything. Another thing that I learned was that race is relational. And I'm sure some of us here might know this, others might not. But essentially, race is a social construct, meaning that we are not born with a race, but a race is put upon us when we are born. So when we say that race is relational, it means that it changes wherever you go. In where I live in Ireland, race is different to where to being in, for example, Nigeria, which is where I'm originally from. Race would be different there. Basically saying that depending on the sphere you are in, the way race is viewed is different. In the Western world, it's different to how it would be viewed in Africa, in Asia, etc., etc. So it's not a fixed thing. And if we know that it is not a fixed thing, then we know that we have the power to change how it is seen in our society too. The last thing that I learned was that Black studies is not confined to the classroom. And what I say by this is that we don't have to limit Black studies to a classroom, to a setting where we just sit down and learn, do an exam, memorize it, and then walk away. No, Black studies is outside. Black studies is on the streets. It's when you get up, you go to work, and you see somebody being discriminated, and you decide to say something and defend that person. Black studies is when you walk outside and you see an injustice happening, and you decide to not be quiet about it, but to actually do something, for example, participating in a peaceful protest. Black studies is something that you learn for the entirety of your life. It's not something that you learn for a few months and then continue as normal. It is something that should become a part of you, because of Black studies is essentially studying what it means to be Black and the effects that it has on, the effects that being Black has on people. And this is something that changes so often, particularly in the society that we're in. So we cannot stop learning after a period of time, but make sure it is a continuous effort. So something that I gained, the things that I gained from this were things such as empowerment, a renewed mind, critical thinking skills, knowledge, and hope. And now I'm going to speak about how Black studies can be included in different disciplines. It does not only have to be limited to essentially education. I have listed here some figures in history and some who are still currently alive now, who have contributed to the world we live in today, but are often not acknowledged. And these people here are all Black persons. And as you can see, I have included in brackets the fields to which some of them are found in. You can look upon it now and see if there's any that you are in, any discipline that you are in, and anybody that you can relate to here. And I believe that if we decide to start celebrating and acknowledging people who have contributed to the world we live in today in our disciplines, in our various subjects, then we will be more likely to see people who look like these same people essentially enter these fields too. So for example, I've listed here Philip Migwali, excuse my pronunciation for any of these names, who's the founder of the world's fastest computer, Sojourner Truth, the women's rights campaigner and abolitionist, Garrett Morgan, the inventor of the 3-light traffic light and the gas mask, Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, an activist and founder of Women's Union during Nigerians' women's anti-colonial struggles, Alexander Miles, the inventor of automatic elevator doors, Charles Drew, the developer of blood banks, Ludwig Marchesane, the inventor of the world's first waterless bathing lotion, and Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Black History Week, which is now Black History Month. So if you look upon this list now, you can see that there are people who are of color in various disciplines, and I'm sure that we can introduce these things into our different fields. It's literally just in the same way that I'm currently studying science and I learn about people who have contributed in science, such as, for example, Isaac Newton. We can mention these people too, and we might not realize how much of an impact it makes, but it truly does do. It truly does do something in even the subconscious of the minds of people listening to you. So now you may be asking, how can I play my part today? And I have actually created a link here. This is a link chi.org.ee/Black Studies, which includes a list of different petitions you can sign, things you can use to educate yourself, and organizations that you can look into to donate to. And one of such I've listed is the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Education Trust, which is a trust which essentially collects stories of people from the BAME community and presents those stories in different ways, also provides information on Black history to schools in different places. I've also included some petitions, as you can see, that make Black British history compulsory in schools, and about medical schools, including BAME representation in clinical teaching, which I believe you will be seeing soon after now. So if you take down this Linktree link, you can visit that after this. And now I say, you might ask yourself, what are the next steps? And essentially what I'd say is this: there are different things that each of us can do. To academics, I recommend that you call meetings at your institutions and assess the degree of ethnic representation in what you are teaching your students. Look upon everything you're reading and everything that you teach, and see if there are ways that you can, firstly, see the degree that you're already doing it at and how much more you can do. To students, I say that after you complete a module or complete a course or a program, speak to your professors, speak to the people at the top of the boards, and tell them that you believe that there should be more representation even in these fields. And these cannot happen. They cannot hear it if we don't first open our mouths and say something first. And obviously encourage your classmates to do the same. To everybody, I ask that we should, if we are trying to push for there to be Black studies even in the educational curriculums and such, then we should email and speak to our governments, try to do as much as we can. Don't wait for somebody else to do it, but try to do it yourself. I was 19 years old when I decided to organize the first Black Studies event to occur in Ireland. So there's no excuse for us to decide to just use the power that we have in our own hands and do something about it. And lastly, I say you educate yourself, because it's never too late. And that is all I have to say today. So thank you everybody for listening, and make sure you act based on what you've heard today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igogo, for your presentation and bringing us into the world of Black Studies and what it has to offer, and what we can really learn about the true histories and the true narratives of Black people and their backgrounds. Next up, we have a medical student called Malone Mukwende. He is a second-year medical student at St. George's University, and he has recently co-authored with academics a booklet called Mind the Gap, and he'll be presenting to you on how that came about. So welcome to the stage, Malone.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I hope you're all having a good day, and thank you to all of the speakers and Abigail. I've been listening in, and this is an amazing event. I'm just going to share my screen. Is that visible?
It is, but you may need to enlarge in the presentation screen.
Today we're going to be talking about a handbook of clinical science in Black and Brown skin, which is entitled Mind the Gap, which I have co-authored alongside 2 other lecturers at my university. To start, this is a little summary about things that we're going to be discussing today. I think this feeds nicely from the work and discussions that have been happening so far. And yeah. So to start off my presentation, I've put a picture, a range of different pictures of what currently medical healthcare in the UK is like for Black patients. So in the top left, we can see the stat that Black patients are half as likely to receive pain medication as white patients. These beliefs and reasons for this stats, actually, if you look back and try and find the answers as to why these things exist and still are existing in 2020, you will find that some of the beliefs which people had during the times of slavery, such as Black people had smaller skulls, or Black people's brains were less advanced, or the nervous system of the Black patient was just not as advanced, so they couldn't feel pain. What people used to use to justify their slavery back then is the reason why some of these things still exist. And one thing which is really prevalent in medicine even to this day is the fact that those beliefs that were held back then, people didn't document them as racist beliefs. More so when this was documented, people would see it as experimentation, and it's almost seen as like you can't question experimentation, like it's science, which clearly is incorrect. In the middle of the page, this is a little girl. Her name is Victoria Climby. I'm sure some of you may be aware of her story. This happened in the early 2000s. She was subject to abuse from her parents, and the relevance of this picture on this slide is the fact that she presented to hospital. And when she presented to hospital, she was told by the doctor at the hospital that she has scabies, when really and truly these are warning signs for the abuse that she was receiving at home. And it makes you wonder, like, if doctors had been able to pick that up earlier, she potentially would have lived another day. In the top right, we see Black women are 5 times more likely to die during childbirth. This is a stat which has been circulating the internet quite a lot of late. And it's very unfortunate because this is a stat which has existed even for about 30, 40 years or even more from now. And it almost feels as though nothing is being done to address the problem. And recently with COVID-19, we saw that patients from a BAME background were more likely to be affected. Black people were 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19. There's a whole host of reasons as to why these stats exist, but for me personally, I look at it sometimes and I think that, oh, maybe that doctors were not giving the correct advice, or they were not telling patients the correct things about coronavirus, hence why they were dying at an alarming rate. Because we even saw that I think 85% of the doctors who died from coronavirus were from a BAME background in the early days. So when people give their arguments about, it's due to like a range of social economic factors, my question to them is then, how do you explain the doctors dying too? And the mental health one in the bottom right corner, this has been touched upon already in today's discussion, but it's known that Black men especially are more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. So following on from the point that I made about coronavirus, this is actually official coronavirus advice, which was given out by the Royal College of Pediatrics. So this is advice which was given to parents of young children to basically tell them what you need to do, get urgent help if you start seeing these symptoms. So one of these symptoms, as we can see, is going blue around the lips. However, in darker skin, it's not as obvious as they make it out to seem, to see whether somebody is going blue around the lips. And that's where my work comes in. This looks like a page of nothing, but I'll explain what it is. So this is actually a analysis which was carried out of the NHS conditions website by a senior manager in the NHS named Ade Adebayumi. He went through all of the conditions on the NHS Choices website, which is the website where if you need any health advice on anything, the NHS website will have all the different information about your condition. So this is a spreadsheet of all of the information. I don't know if anyone can see, but I've actually zoomed it out to -10, and there's still room to keep scrolling, which shows you the extent of the amount of conditions. So on this list of conditions, there is 1,007 different conditions on the NHS website, and not a single condition on that website has a picture of darker skin. So it's almost as if the NHS website has assumed that everybody coming to this website will have white skin. So potentially a lot of the time, the health advice that is being given out by that website can potentially misinform some of the patients which are coming to view the website. I have included this poem. It says it's from Malcolm X, but I'm not 100% sure of the source because there's many different sources, but I don't think that's the focus of the poem. More so to say that this poem really highlights how the use of descriptors and the use of terminology that we use and its impact that it has. So if I just read out the poem, it's: when I'm born, I'm black. When I grow up, I'm black. When I'm in the sun, I'm black. When I'm sick, I'm black. When I die, I'm black. And you, when you're born, you're pink. When you grow up, you're white. When you're cold, you're blue. When you're sick, you're green. And when you die, you're grey. And you dare to call me coloured. So this just kind of is a really powerful poem, which illustrates the impact of the language which is currently being used in medical education and how it almost segregates a group of people who simply don't apply to these descriptors which are being used at the moment. This is also another slide which is almost testimonial to the work which I've been doing. And I know I haven't explained the actual work as of yet, but I wanted to put this slide in here to kind of make people realize the impact that it's already having thus far and why this is almost a global problem and not only confined to the UK. So we can see here in the middle to the right of the page that people in US medical schools are also complaining about the same problem. We can see that in Germany, German medical students are also asking for a translation of the work. In the bottom left is a woman who's explaining about how after an operation, she was told to look for redness of the skin. And clearly she's complaining, how is she meant to look for that? So sometimes it almost feels like with these terminology and without the pictures, we're almost just leaving a group of patients to just almost navigate through healthcare by themselves. And we as healthcare professionals and future healthcare professionals need to do a better job at addressing that. So this is where we start talking about Mind the Gap itself and the moment that you guys have all been waiting for. So for me, I undertook a staff-student partnership at my university, which allowed me to work with 2 other members of staff on the project. And we started this work in December last year, and we finished it in May 2020. COVID-19 came as a huge delay to the work, where I could go and see my members of staff who I was working with in their offices. All of a sudden now I'm having to send an email and wait like a day to get a response, 2 days, sometimes even longer. I posted it on my social media platforms, and since then it's been seen over 30 million times. If I was to estimate, given other people's reshares from notable people such as Lupita, John Boyega, Winnie Harlow, and various other Instagram pages, I believe that this post has been seen in excess of 100 million. The work has also featured in the House of Lords, ITV, BBC, Sky News, the British Medical Journal, Newsrun, Fox News, ABC and Disney TV, the Washington Post, and many, many more. So a question that I get asked a lot of the time is people are like, oh, why now? Why now? And I think given all that has happened this year surrounding COVID-19 and even the Black Lives Matter movement, it's very clear that the world has almost woke up or is now hyper aware of a lot of the problems that are going on in the world. One of them being the suffering of Black people. And I think COVID-19 perfectly illustrates how, although people can sit there and want to almost deny racism, but stats and what is going on and people losing their lives is it doesn't lie. It's just what is hard facts, and we need to accept that and work together to almost dismantle that. I think one thing that I almost have to put out there, and I'm sure many people in this Zoom call will be aware, but I just always have to put it out there, is that this isn't a trend. This is not work that I've almost undertaken just to almost jump on the bandwagon as per se. Many of these issues have been prevalent for many years. Many people have also spoken out about these issues, but it almost feels like they have been silenced in the process. Hence why it almost feels like we're making slow progression towards tackling some of these health disparities. So what exactly is Mind the Gap? So Mind the Gap is a handbook of clinical signs in Black and brown skin. Mind the Gap as a book itself contains pictures and descriptors of what things appear like in darker skins. So from my own personal journey, it became very apparent to me when I arrived at medical school that we weren't actually being taught on darker skin. And there was no reason when I would question it as to why we're not being taught. And the unfortunate thing is that many people were unaware that this was even a problem. And when I would raise it, people would look at me like I'm mad. And the issue of being taught on darker skins is just one of many issues which are currently existing in medical teaching, which almost allows biases to manifest from a grassroots level as early as first year of medical education. So then when these guys go on and qualify, it's almost like they've carried these biases through 5 years of medical school, and now they're going out into the world and potentially even harming people with these biases that they've allowed to manifest. And these biases have implications, and one of those implications is the lack of trust that it is found that Black people tend to have with healthcare practitioners. And that's due to the fact that many can attest to a story of misdiagnosis or not being taken seriously or not being given medication when they've cried out for it, or even like some of the stats that we saw, like Black women even dying in childbirth. So that level of trust between the Black community is just something which is not there at the moment. And historically speaking, this is a level of trust which has never been present, because from even colonial times, times of slavery, the Black bodies were almost used for medical experimentation a lot. And it's like we see many accounts of this in history, such as Mariam Sims and his experimentation on Black women for gynecological advances. Even things which are more recent, such as the Tuskegee experiment, where a group of scientists, if I can call them that, injected syphilis into a group of Black men. And even with the Henrietta Lacks story, where her cells were taken and they're still used to this day, and many pharmaceutical companies have profited many amounts from her cells, which were taken without her awareness at the time, and the family didn't gain anything or were unaware of this happening for many years. So I earlier mentioned about the impact that the work is having thus far. This is actually screenshots from a conversation which happened in the House of Lords last week. So the impact of the work has already started to shift government discussions as to why this hasn't been addressed earlier. Why are we still learning from a point of view where we're not addressing things that appreciate everyone? So the government actually asked what the medical schools are actually doing to address this issue. I'm hoping that the medical schools can also respond to the issue that they're tackling at hand, but it's almost clear to see from my own instances and my own conversations that nobody really is doing anything, and a lot of the posts that they're posting out there from these institutions are almost performative and almost tokenistic, because it's clear to see that There is no action plans in place. Hence why I encourage all of you who are watching this and everyone, even if you're not in a position to necessarily speak to an institution, but start raising these issues, because it is clear that people almost don't know what to do, but they know that they need to do something. Another way that we are also assessing impact with my work, Mind the Gap is not only just a handbook. We carried out a training session at my university to kind of get an insight into how some of these biases are allowed to manifest, allow people to almost have the opportunity to unlearn some of these biases that they've allowed to manifest during their time at medical school. So we carried it out with a small cohort of 27 due to the constraints of like online learning. We couldn't do it face to face. And prior to the session starting, we gave out a feedback form to see what kind of views they had before. And prior to the session, 71% of students stated that they could not state how pallid presents on black and brown skin. And pallor is just going pale, essentially. And this can be indicative of so many things, such as lack of oxygen, even things such as anemia. And to think that 71% of third to final year medical students were not able to identify that on darker skin is very concerning, because these are potentially the doctors of tomorrow. These are the people who will look after our kids and for many generations to come. However, after the trading session, 66% had now agreed that they could describe how pallor presents on darker skin. And 99% of students strongly agreed that they felt more confident in creative and more inclusive environment, which is very important, because I myself cannot have all of the answers to all of the problems that currently exist in medical education. However, if we empower one another and empower everybody else to start speaking about this, start making action rather than just almost giving us words just so that we can shut up, I think it's so important for that. And 99% strongly agreed that they could inform the lead tutor if material didn't appear inclusive. This is such an important point, because a lot of the time, many people would be almost too scared to challenge that. Oh, okay, you describe it as blue around the lips, but what does it look like on darker skin? Because we almost get silence for raising these issues sometimes. So it's really positive to see that many people felt a little bit more confidence that they could even challenge these issues. So going forwards with the work, and going forwards even advice as to many people who are in this call, it's important to understand that health inequalities are multifactorial. A lot of the time when we discuss health inequalities, currently even in my experiences with medical education, we will always be quick to break it down to, socioeconomic factors, age, comorbidities, and various stuff like that. When sometimes one factor which we also need to acknowledge and we also need to start speaking about a lot more is the factor that some of the legacies of slavery still exist in healthcare to this day. So like we saw earlier about the pain medication, that it was a belief that people just had about Black people at the time, and it's been allowed to manifest and grow and grow and grow, and it's just continued all the way to this day and age. One thing which is imperative to all aspects of medicine, even aside from my work, that prevention is better than cure. So if we can prevent these health inequalities from happening in the first place, it is even financially a benefit to everyone that we don't have to pump loads of money into curing something which could have been prevented before it happened. And that's where some of my work even stems in, because potentially, if we're educating the future doctors of tomorrow, we hope that some of these healthcare disparities can start to be eradicated. Of course, this won't happen overnight, as Rome wasn't built in a day, but if we can start making those steps towards that, I believe that one day we'll get to a point where some of these disparities can even be eradicated. It is impossible to address these inequalities without a personalized approach to care. One thing which happens a lot of the time, and my experiences at medical school, I speak from only a personal experience and not for everyone studying medicine, is that a lot of the time, even at the moment with COVID-19, we will bunch all of the BAME individuals into one box and bunch all of the white people into one box, and then say, oh, this is the way that we can reduce inequalities and the deaths of the BAME individuals. However, sometimes this doesn't entirely work, because the problem of someone from South Asia, for instance, is not the same problem of someone who's African. So, and each culture and each group of people almost have their taboos and even their beliefs about healthcare. So it's important that we individualize these approaches so that we can effectively reach out to all of these people. I think one thing that's so imperative and so important is that leadership comes from the community. Leadership needs to come from us, the members of the community, so that we can almost direct the change from the ground up, because I personally feel like if we wait from a change from the top down, we'll be waiting for many years. And it's very clear to see from a lot of the stats which are existing out there that some of these things haven't been addressed for many years. So I believe that each and every one of us has enough power to do so, to address these problems from the ground up. One of the most important things, and I think with all of the work and every other speaker who spoke today, I think it's so important that we measure the impact and assess how effective these policies are, both new and existing and future, because although we have all of these wonderful ideas and what we want to do to dismantle these systems, it doesn't necessarily mean that the first idea that we try is going to solve the problem. So we need to have a mechanism in place to almost assess the impacts, and if we see that it's not working, we almost adapt the practice and essentially change so that we can move forwards instead of using one method, it doesn't work, and then we're back to square one. Training for medical training, it needs to improve. A lot of the time, there's been many stories I've heard from older students where they've been subject to racial abuse by patients, but it almost feels like there isn't a system in place to allow the students to even speak about what's going on, because to the patient, they're still going to get their care, they're still going to get everything they wanted. So potentially it even raises the point, like, are we enabling this behavior to continue? Because it almost feels like there is no consequences for people who are allowing their racial thoughts to impact other individuals. So going forwards, and this is my call to action and almost my advice for many people in this call. In the short term, I think we need to start raising awareness and start calling out some of the issues in everybody's individual roles. I think although many people almost feel silenced and almost feel like they can't take on an institution, they can't tackle problems, the problem's bigger than them. Like, some people have even heard say stuff like, oh, this problem has been there for many years, what can I do to possibly solve it? I believe that all of us have the power to influence a decision, and you're never too small to make a change. I think it's also important to start educating yourself on some of the issues that exist, because I think one thing as well, like myself, although I am Black, I wasn't aware of some of the problems that even Black people were facing. So I almost had to educate myself on some of these problems too. Like, I cannot sit here and say that I have all the answers on everything that Black people have been affected by in healthcare. Following on from that, I think it's so important that representation matters. This is almost a call and a plea to everyone who almost is a big minority in whatever field they're in. For me personally, I'm only one of 3 Black boys on a course of about 250 students. So relatively, I'm a very, very small voice in the student population. However, I have tried to use my voice as strongly as possible to amplify things which are affecting people of darker skin. In the medium term, like I mentioned earlier, we need to have measures to assess the impacts of the work that we're carrying out, and we also need to be able to reflect on this work. In the long term, I think it's important that we collaboratively work as a community to dismantle some of these problems that currently exist. I believe that as a group, we're entirely powerful, and once we start working together, we'll be able to tackle a lot more of these problems. And the final slide, this is even an exclusive. The 100 or so people in this presentation are the first people to even see this. Unfortunately, at this moment in time, Mind the Gap is not out, and we're still working on the best way to disseminate it best across the world. However, this is a website which I've made, which will allow you to sign up to a mailing list, so that when Mind the Gap is out, you'll be able to be one of the first people to know and to be able to have access to it. If you use your phone and open your camera and just scan the QR code on the right, it should take you to the website, and then you can fill in the newsletter form and you will have access to the work as soon as it's out. But I'm working on making this available as soon as possible. And that ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Malone. Thank you for highlighting the health inequities within the medical industry, and also reminding us to use our collective voice, and that collective action can really bring about change. And we may just be one individual, but together we're a whole community and a whole society, and we are strong as long as we do stand up and use our voices. So thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Deborah Gabriel, and she'll be presenting to us her work on the 3D pedagogy framework. Dr. Deborah Gabriel is an academic, she's a consultant, and she is the founder and director of Black British Academics. So if you join me in welcoming to the stage, Miss Deborah, hello.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. Could you, do you mind just yeah, thank you, great, perfect.
My recommendations in the context of this discussion that we've had today is that anyone and any institution and anyone in a position with responsibility for teaching, for programs, is that you need to start with a review of what it is that you teach on your programs. Too often I see that things are done in a very piecemeal fashion. When I advise and consult with universities, often it's when they're in the process of introducing a new program, or it's when they're in the process of revalidation, and that's the best time, because it's when they're ready to actually implement significant changes. So reviewing programs means that you need to look at who's teaching this stuff. Is there equity in terms of the teaching? How are they teaching? That's in terms of their pedagogy and the curriculum that they're working from. And what are the student outcomes? And by that I mean, what are the students' experiences? And if you're trying to focus on anti-Black racism, then you need to look at specifically what are the experiences of Black students. Stop trying to add diversity. Stop trying to add diversity into a course that's already problematic. It's already Eurocentric. It's already tokenistic, or it's already exclusionary. So you can't fix that by sticking in a couple of references of Black people, in week 10 or week 12. You need to start with equity. And thirdly, when it comes to addressing anti-Black racism and addressing the shortcomings in the curriculum, white people need to be allies working with and not leading Black students and staff in race equality initiatives, especially in relation to decolonization. And that's because, as I said, decolonization, decoloniality, right, was developed by and for people of African descent. And the whole purpose of it is that it emerges from the lived experience of Black people. So how can you decolonize if you're not Black and you really don't have a lived experience, right, of what it means to be racially oppressed? Now, I'm not saying that if you're a white person, you should not be trying to work and contribute to decolonization, but I'm saying that you're not in a position to lead such work, but you should be working with Black students and with staff, and they should be developing this work. The 3D pedagogy framework was developed in consultation with Black students, with the student union from my university. I tested out the 3D pedagogy workshop with the student union before I actually implemented it. And I also developed a component of 3D pedagogy, which is actually for Black students and other students that want to contribute to the curriculum, to social justice in the curriculum. So it's not just something that's for staff, it's for students as well. It has to be a kind of co-created process. So that's what I've got to say. And if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for that.
That was very quick.
It was, and it's good that it was quick because we are time constrained at the moment. Thank you for that presentation and for all your hard work in providing us with a framework, an inclusive curriculum framework, and the strategic model that we can really take into our own classrooms and areas of work and implement it there and co-create with students as well. And thank you for your recommendations. If anyone does have any questions for Dr. Deborah, then please put them in the Q&A box and she'll be happy to respond there. And we'll go straight in to our next presenter, who is Paulette Williams. She is the founder of Leading Roots, and she's also the Student Success Project Manager for UCL. And she'll be presenting to you about the broken pipeline and where universities can now find solutions. Thank you, Paulette. If you'd like to take to the stage. Hello.
Unmute myself. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Right, let me try and share my screen. Is that working, Abigail?
It is perfect.
Brilliant. All right, so I'll get started. I'm going to put my timer on so I don't go over too much or at all because it's been a long afternoon, but an incredible afternoon. Some amazing speakers, and just thanks to Abigail for inviting me and for organising this. So, as you heard, I am founder of Leading Roots. We're an organisation that supports Black students through the pipeline. So we've got programs for students who are undergrads, or sorry, about to go into undergrad and kind of need advice. We advise their parents as well and give them information. And then all the way through to postgraduate research. So we've got a Black in Academia campaign, which kind of provides information and events for students who are thinking about doing a PhD. So with my UCL hat on, I co-lead on the BAME Awarding Gap project. So my presentation today is kind of like a mix of both. And whilst, you know, I'm definitely aware of kind of issues specifically relating to Black students, some of what I will talk about will sort of come from my work at UCL, but I'll kind of speak a little bit more about why it's important that we have some sort of specificity around that sort of work as well as we go along. So I want to kind of warn you as well that my slides are a bit wordy. I don't normally do wordy slides, but I want to kind of get everything in, and hopefully they'll be available after so you can have a read, but don't feel like you have to read everything. All right. So today I've kind of been asked to look at the challenges that Black students face throughout the pipeline, and ultimately when it comes to pursuing an academic career. I'll be exploring how those challenges have been addressed by the sector so far and some of the limitations that these solutions present. and kind of looking at what we can learn. And although I've kind of spoken about solutions, I'm not really necessarily going to give any. I will ask questions that I think institutions should sort of think about in order to find the answers for their own universities. So my career started in access and widening participation. And if you're not aware, WP was an initiative that was started by the Labour government, I think in around 2000. And the aim was to get 50% of young people into higher education within 10 years. And when they spoke about underrepresented groups, this was students that went to schools where there were low participation rates, students that lived in areas that were in low participation neighborhoods. And we use a measure called POLAR to determine that, which we're using less and less now because it's not necessarily that accurate. Students with disabilities, mature students, and of course, students from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. So there was a real push. And, you know, the skeptic in me, if you look at the sector now, sort of 10, 20 years on, and think about where we are in terms of fees and, you know, what students get for that money, that sort of real push to get students into university is an interesting one. But I won't go into all of that. I will ask though, kind of, you know, if you ask, was that initiative successful? I think Labour would like to think it was. And in 2019, yeah, 50% of young people attend university by the age of 30. So that's great. But when you dig a bit deeper, you can see that the concentration is in post-92 institutions. And so, you know, access to the elite Russell Group research intensive universities is still not there for people from underrepresented backgrounds. And we see the numbers are extremely low for Black students as well. So I think when we think about the success of these initiatives, what the point I want to make throughout this presentation is what can we learn from things that we've done before that haven't necessarily, that have seemed successful, but haven't necessarily been that successful when you dig a bit deeper. We've seen a 50% increase in the number of BME undergraduates, but then you've got extremely low retention rates for Black students. They're 50% more likely to drop out. We're talking about 10% of Black students. That's a lot of undergrads that start university and just, you know, for whatever reason, whether it's financial, whether it's fitting in, belonging issues, they drop out. And of course, then we also have the awarding gap or attainment gap, if that's what you call it. And we're still seeing that there's a huge gap between the number of Black students in particular and white students that get a 1st or 2-1 or a good degree. So what we're seeing now is a lot more institutions kind of moving towards, particularly elite institutions, moving towards contextual offers. So using what we call positive action to try and increase the numbers. And I want to kind of make the point that this is not a, volume is not always a sign of success, right? So numbers is not always a sign that things are going well. And that is evident when you look at the experiences that people are having. So I will note as well that for our students, we work with a cohort of year 13 students, and we're supporting them to sort of transition into university. And they understand the issues, right? They'll apply for these programs, they'll apply to get more support. Some students are very savvy, very strategic about going on to access programs, you know, the summer schools or the mentoring school visits, all that sort of thing. But they still know what the issues are. They still understand, right? And when we think about the emergency measures that have been put in place recently for COVID-19 around the A-level exams, we did a small survey with our cohort, and they were well aware of teacher bias and how that can affect them in the coming months, or next month, should I say. So we're not fooling anyone by kind of doing this work and not addressing the issue. And I'm not knocking WP. I know people that work in WP that are doing amazing work and that they genuinely want to see change, but I think it's going to take a little bit more. So I want to make the point that the media have kind of played a huge role in kind of pushing the issues around the Black and Asian student experience to the forefront. But a lot of this has come from students. We've had some amazing students on the call today, and it's a good and bad thing. We're hearing their voice and making sure that, you know, they know they're being heard. But universities do need to take responsibility for this. And there's a whole thing around accountability and responsibility that I think is definitely missing. So yeah, I think shout out to all the students that are doing the work, but universities really need to respond and value them a lot more and their contribution. So I've touched on the awarding gap and what it is, and I'm sure you're all very aware of it, but it's not new. You know, this awarding gap has been around for decades, and we've moved from this kind of deficit model approach and denial tactics. You know, is it because it's, you know, to do with class? And, you know, it's important to point out here that the gap is around UK domiciled students, right? These are UK students. And I've even been in meetings and I hear it all the time where people say, is it because of the, you know, English, because they speak English as a second language? And, you know, I still don't understand how we get there, how people just still think that there's a language barrier or a language issue when quite clearly we're saying it's UK students. Anyway, we're now at a stage where we're talking about kind of deeper analysis, analysis that can take into account all these other factors and can still say that there's an unexplained gap. And we would say that that gap is due to discrimination, I would say racism. But some people don't want to say that, but that's what it is, right? So I won't go into too much detail about the issues with BAME because some of the previous speakers have done that, but you can just see from these statistics, looking at, for example, even within the Asian category, the difference between Indian students attainment and Pakistani students is quite large. But most importantly, looking at the difference between the gap for Black students compared to white students and Asian students compared to white students. And we can see that the gap for Black students is so much more significant and needs to be tackled. So I've skipped over postgrad taught because on the whole, postgraduate taught, there is representation. And I think, you know, I don't know it, I don't have all the stats around that, but I think it's definitely anecdotally due to the fact that we gain more qualifications to try and be more competitive in the labour market. That undergraduate degree, we're still at a disadvantage when we enter the labour force. And so it's quite common for us to do more qualifications to try and stand out. And so for us, that postgraduate taught route is kind of more about that than it is about going into postgraduate research. And I think that's an important point because it kind of points to the fact that a lot of the time, Black students aren't being made aware of postgraduate research, PhDs, thinking about a career in academia. It's not presented to us, despite the fact that it's extremely challenging anyway, but it's not necessarily presented to us. And we know that a lot of students who are, well, white students, they get a tap on the shoulder and someone says to them, have you thought about doing a PhD? This could be from undergraduate. But for our students, this doesn't happen. And this is just one of the ways that bias, prejudice, discrimination begins to play a role in why we're not moving further within academia. So last year in September, Leading Roots released the Broken Pipeline report, and it kind of stemmed from our Black in Academia campaign, which kind of asked, where are all the Black academics? Where are, you know, all the Black professors? We have a lot more now, and they inspire me so much. But we've got a long way to go, right? So what is happening, I think for us at Leading Roots, we understand our limitations as an organization, and we very much focus on supporting the students. But that doesn't mean that we can't challenge the sector. That doesn't mean that we can't ask these difficult questions. And it was my colleague Chantel who really pushed for, you know, us to kind of look deeper into this. And this is a statistic that we found, which really was kind of like the key stat from our report. So over a 3-year period, just 1.2% of studentships from all of the UKRI research councils were awarded to Black or Black mixed students. And just 30 of those, and that's almost 20,000, went to Black Caribbean students. So we can see where the issue is in terms of funding and getting a funded PhD. But what I think is interesting is when you begin to dig deeper, who is responsible for this? This is an area that has gone completely unaddressed, and I don't believe that that everyone was shocked about these stats. I think some people are well aware of these statistics, but there's no clear ownership on the issue. So UKRI will kind of say, yeah, the universities, they're kind of responsible for, they can do what they want, and you know, they're responsible for this. The universities will say, we're quite limited by UKRI and their rules. But no one, you know, it doesn't really sit with a particular team. So that was one of the first things that we found. In addition to that, the key question here is, if we're talking, if I go back to here, when we were saying that institutions are now taking more responsibility because they've seen the data and they can't deny it anymore and they can't challenge it anymore. And they acknowledge that there's a disadvantage for Black students in terms of getting a first or 2-1. Why do we then come here and then they say, right, in order to get a studentship, you need a first or 2-1? There's a complete disconnect within the institutions. And when we talk about a broken pipeline, I think that's one of the key things that I think it's important to kind of note. So I think just thinking about now on what we've learned from interventions and things that have been put in place so far, I would say it's important to definitely have an awareness of disparities. That's really important. And acknowledging that different students come to higher education with different capital. However, these remedies alone will not solve the issue. So putting in place summer schools, etc. alone is not going to help a student who does get a place and experiences racism within your institution. Or having contextual offers is important, but it's not going to help students that come to your institution and just experience a completely Eurocentric curriculum, as Deborah was speaking about earlier on. So it's so important for institutions to actually take a university-wide approach. And many kind of see this as, right, let's try and address one particular issue. So for example, the BAME awarding gap across the university. So let's bring in EDI, let's talk to the departments and the faculties and, you know, the staff development team, and make sure we're all working together. But arguably, this is also about making sure that we're working as an institution across the whole student life cycle, so that a student facing an issue in undergraduate isn't seeing the same thing being replicated or manifested when they have a job. And that's basically what's happening in higher education. So positive action is great. A lot of universities are using positive action, but I don't think it solves the real core issues that we have. And culture change is going to take time. It's not a quick fix. It's not something that you can do overnight. And so it needs true commitment in terms of resources and sort of making sure that there's sustainable and realistic changes. And when we talk about things like institutional racism, for example, I think it makes you think of like this university building that just sits on its own and is really mean. And it's kind of important that we acknowledge that an institution is people. It's the staff, it's the students. And it's important that that behavior, the practices and the policies are changed in order for us to see anything shift, right? So I think we need to have the awareness, which is an important first step. Staff and students need to feel confident about making changes. There are, in my experience, many people who want to do something but don't quite know what to do. And then there are more resistant people that I think we need sort of more accountability in place, more sanctions in place. And we're seeing that those sanctions are definitely coming a bit more from in terms of external. So OFS are a bit more likely these days to sanction people for things. I don't think I've seen any in relation to the awarding gap yet, but hopefully that might be coming. So yeah, I think it's just important that we're aware that where the responsibility lies and institutions really push that message forward. So where can universities find solutions? Definitely the use of data, not the abuse of data. Some people will sit down and crunch numbers for years just to prove a point, just to find a way. And we're in a university, that's how, right, it's so frustrating because we've got some amazing people that can do that sort of stuff, but we don't have time for that now. You know, just accept the issue and utilize the data to get a clear picture of what's happening at your institution. So again, looking at the entire life cycle for students and asking, you know, where are the gaps? Are they not applying? If they are applying, are they not being accepted? Then you can begin to ask questions about why. Again, the ownership of the issues, who's responsible, and if it's lots of different people, how are they communicating with each other? But ultimately, who is accountable? And that's so important. We spoke today about the student voice and making sure that students feel heard. And I learned a lesson this week as well around, I think I would say for students now, it's a great time because the doors open, I would say, for many institutions. But I think students are still kind of, there's still that feeling that you're not being heard. And so we kind of often take a campaigning approach. And I think that's the responsibility of the institution to let students know that we are open to listening to you. We are here. This is not like, you know, a one-off campaign for 3 months and then, you know, we're here to listen to you. This is not about focus groups and surveys where, you know, kind of do, we sit you down in a room and have you kind of do the emotional labor of sharing really distressing experiences and then you'd never hear anything again, right? So find that balance between listening to students and then also making students do the emotional labor. Even if you've paid them, I still think there's a way to do this work and collaboratively. And again, as Deborah kind of touched on earlier on, it's about co-creation. Definitely looking at selection processes. There are so many unwritten rules, especially when it comes to postgrad, where it's kind of like not on the website, but everyone knows. And ask yourself, does everyone know? Who are the students that know these things? And who are the decision makers? And how much autonomy do they get to just do and decide what they want? And I've heard awful stories. You know, this process is so open to individual bias. I've heard stories about students having to submit a picture along with their application. Are we still there? Like, are we still doing that? How can we really be honest about these processes and making sure that they're robust? And finally, just thinking about academic excellence and what that means. And okay, but let's even move on from that conversation about the first or 2-1. Dig a bit deeper. When you're asking for a first or 2-1, what exactly do you want? What exactly do you think that's telling you about that candidate? Because you'll hear it from many, many academics and people who are recruiting and supervisors, and they'll say that the high achieving students aren't necessarily the best PhD students. So yeah, it's just important that we reflect on, question, interrogate all the things that we're doing and why we're doing them. And, you know, I've had this conversation before, but COVID-19 and how we've responded in HE is a perfect example of actually asking why do we make certain decisions when we can do things so differently. So I'll just finish here by just talking about, I was asked to talk about, you know, that pipeline leading into careers in academia. And as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the issues is that it's the same problems that resurface again and again and just take a different form because we're not addressing them earlier on. I also think there's this whole thing about academia generally just being a little bit toxic, a little bit challenging, and, you know, everyone experiences it. But I think it's important that institutions acknowledge that, you know, doing a PhD and, you know, it being challenging and a bit isolating and impacting mental health and adding on racial discrimination, it just turns it into a completely different process. And it's not easy, and it's not necessarily appealing either. So I think just not, lost the word, not ignoring the fact that racism does play a role in this and just trying to sort of lump it all together as like a difficult experience. And asking the questions, do institutions actually value our presence in higher education? So there was a study that was done and it looked at a whole load of theses over, I think, over 30 years. And it showed that students from underrepresented groups actually innovate at a higher rate than other students, but often our contributions are just ignored and disregarded. And we see that again with students that are applying for PhDs. And if the person on the other side who gets that application doesn't understand the subject area or doesn't understand the methodology, immediately it's wrong. And again, this is where we start talking about decolonizing and what that truly means. And I think a lot of institutions think they're kind of decolonizing right now, and you're just really not. Inclusivity is great, but there's deeper work that really needs to be done. Generally, just thinking about the toxic environments that are failing students, how do they challenge racism when incidents happen? How supportive are your frameworks and processes, and will they be heard, and can they trust you? And yeah, you know, are you welcoming Black people into HE? And I would say from undergraduate all the way through, the answer to that question is no. And no one really wants to be where they're not welcome. But the power of higher education, you know, definitely within the Black community, we understand the power of education. You know, we're talking from slavery through to now. So when you talk about raising aspirations, like we're good. The issue is what's happening within educational institutions and how that's having an impact on our self-esteem, our ability to progress, and, you know, our desire to want to be in those environments. So I'll leave it there. I've got my stopwatch and I'm 5 minutes over. But yeah, happy to take any questions along with Deborah as we move on.
Thank you very much, Paulette, for that presentation on the broken pipeline. It's a very critical presentation, the pipeline from students to professorship and how universities can support students to get to where they need to be and get to where they want to be, but also as well with academics and promotion with their career trajectories. You know, if you've got two candidates and they both have equal merit, and one of them's come through, you know, the racial discrimination and that isolating, grueling experience that you spoke about, I mean, which one are you going to choose? Like, why would you always choose that the same type of candidates that look like you, that you're familiar with, and that are contributing the same things, the same ideas, the same perspectives that have been circulating and shared for years? Why wouldn't you take the other candidate that has that experience, has that merit, but also they have immense potential to do even greater because of what they've come through? So yeah, thank you very much for that, Paulette. Our next speaker is Claire Herbert. She's a equality, diversity and inclusion practitioner, and her company is called Advancing EDI. And she will be talking to us about what universities can do next in regards to responses to racial inequity. So universities are saying we're fully committed to advancing race equality, so please welcome to the stage, Claire.
Thank you, Abigail. Hi everyone. Let me get the presentation up. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Abigail, for organising this, and it's been fantastic listening to everyone's presentations. It's been a really, really informative afternoon, so thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to talk about universities' responses, so the rhetoric versus the reality. All universities, all vice-chancellors say we are fully committed to advancing race equality, but, and there's always a but. So I want to have a brief look at a brief history of universities' knowledge of racial inequalities. I want to think just briefly about common university responses to racial inequalities and why we haven't made more progress, and then possible next steps for the sector as well. So if we start here, I know it's a boring place to go at 6 o'clock on a Friday afternoon or Friday evening, but let's just think just briefly about the legislation surrounding this. We know that we've had legislation since the 60s to advance race equality in this country. So there was a 65 Race Relations Act, a 76 Race Relations Act, and then there was a 2000 Act that put a public sector duty on every public body to have a race equality scheme and to proactively advance race equality. That then got subsumed by the Equality Act in 2010, which focused on transparency and publication of data. Now, what did the legislation achieve? Well, not a lot, clearly, otherwise we wouldn't still be here. A review by Professor Gus John found in 2003 that university race equality schemes pretty much weren't fit for purpose. They certainly weren't legally compliant. But I really want to emphasise that the 2010 Act did make universities have to publish data on their staff and students every year. Now, I don't know about your universities, but most of the universities I work with, to get something published, to get anything published, it has to go through several committees, probably the senior management team and probably the university council. So that means that across the 130 odd higher education institutes in the United Kingdom, every year for the last decade at least, they will have seen a report highlighting stark racial inequalities, and they have not done anything about it. They haven't acted on it. I'm also coming at this from a policy perspective. So I used to work at the Equality Challenge Unit and help develop the Race Equality Charter. And I'll come back to that one. And I've seen all the research and all the statistics that have been sent to every university. And in addition to that, the Higher Education Statistics Agency was formed back in 1995, 25 years ago. So as a sector, we've got 25 years of data highlighting stark racial inequalities in our sector, and they haven't been acted upon. I actually wonder if it's almost made things worse. We're using that data to benchmark ourselves. Universities are thinking, well, we're the same as that university, we're the same as our competitor, so we're all right. And actually, I think that almost makes things worse. It's made us more complacent. So in addition to the legislation, while I was at ECU, which was established in 2001, so again, going back an awful long time, by the funding councils. So the funding councils knew there was something wrong. They established an organisation specifically to look at advancing equality and creating statistical reports every year, which are sent to universities every year. So every vice-chancellor in the country sees this report every year and can see that there are stark inequalities. And it's also worth noting that ECU was established in 2001 by the funding councils, and there were vice-chancellors on the board of ECU every year that it existed. So universities have known about these inequalities for 2 decades, essentially, for a really, really long time. In addition to legislation, in addition to statistical reports, there's research everywhere. There is so much research. It's coming out of our ears. And it's brilliant research. It's by really top-notch academics. It's by trade unions. It's by organisations like the ECU or Advanced HE as it is now. So we've got this information. We know all the issues that are there. And the backdrop of that as well, you've got tireless grassroots civil rights campaigners campaigning for this as well, and yet we haven't acted on it. I want to draw on this from Tamina Chowdhury from Middlesex University. She wrote this for a blog for Wonk or Wonk HE, and it was in response to universities' statements that they put out in response to Black Lives Matter. So universities put out various rhetorical statements saying how committed they were to race equality in response to Black Lives Matter. And she kind of summed it up this way, in the way that students view these statements. The university says, "We have a commitment to exposing and challenging racial inequality." And the students respond, "Well, why don't you have a single Black professor then?" The universities say, "We stand together with our Black students, staff and communities." And the students say, "I literally dropped out of your university because you took no action against racial bullying." The university says, "We are proud of our diversity and welcome students from 140 different countries." And I think this is very common where we mistake internationalization for race equity. And the students say, "This vague statement isn't even the bare minimum. Why don't you use words like race or Black?" And the university says, "We have a zero tolerance approach to any harassment and work hard to create a welcoming and diverse experience." And the students say, why don't you ever take any actual action to support people of colour, to diversify your curriculum or to listen to our concerns?" And I think we've all heard horror stories of universities where they know they have that academic, they know they have that person there, and yet they've done very little about it. So what have universities done? Surely they've done something, right? I think there are still some universities that claim that they just didn't know about the inequalities. I'm sure they're there. And when I deliver training, we hear lots of individuals who still look shocked at the idea that there are degree awarding gaps. And I just don't buy it. There's too much history, there's too much information, there's been too much research. So then you kind of come down to, well, maybe they don't understand the scale of the issues, or maybe they just don't prioritize it enough. But with both of those, really, it comes down to apathy. If you don't understand the scale of the issue, it's because you haven't bothered looking into it enough. And if you haven't prioritized it enough, it's because you don't care enough. And I think that apathy has led to us taking the wrong approach, or taking the right approach, but not resourcing it enough. If we look at an example of this, sorry, we will come back to an example of this. It leads to quick fixes. Now, other people have spoken about this already this afternoon, and Jamelia said we need to think about the marathon, and I completely agree about that. Universities love quick fixes though, and it's really, really appealing. Quick fixes mostly involve people of colour in a deficit approach. It's trying to fix the individual to fit in with the mainstream culture, and white people are pretty much exempt from it. It often leads to work avoidance. So this is the point Paulette just made. Don't abuse the data. Rather than doing something about the data, generate more data. Oh, maybe we need to find out a little bit more. Maybe we need to do a bit more research into this, rather than actually doing something about the information you already have. Quick fixes are relatively cheap. They don't really take as much time, and they don't have as much cost implication. They are quick, and they can lead to tokenistic results. So you can make a really nice report for your council saying, we organised X events this year. Over Black History Month, we had X speakers come in and talk to us. You know, we set up a mentoring scheme for X, Y, and Z. And actually, it looks very good on paper. You're signing off saying, tick, 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 we did all these different things. But actually, the outcome of those outputs is probably very little progress. And this is just a personal gripe I've got at the moment with the university I'm working with. This need to be innovative and sector leading. And it's usually white people that ask people to be innovative and sector leading, by which they seem to think that the reason we haven't made more progress is because a great mind like theirs hasn't been thinking about it enough to come up with this brilliant innovative solution, rather than thinking that they themselves are in fact the problem And it's not about being innovative. And I don't want to contradict the earlier presentation. Of course, creativity is good, but it can't be used tokenistically. Long-term solutions involve white people, and white people don't really want to get involved. Long-term solutions are hard work and resource intensive, and everyone has to play their part. And the white majority group have to listen, they need to learn, and they need to change. If we think about this in terms of the low proportion of Black professors, when you speak about, well, why haven't we got enough Black professors? Why have we got so many white people as professors? We immediately go to deficit approach discussions. We talk about confidence, aspirations, pipeline, cultural capital, when really we need to be thinking about racist stereotypes, conscious and unconscious bias, people not acknowledging their white privilege, the moving goalposts and lack of transparency, informal mentoring of predominantly white people, and the tap on the shoulder to apply for that brilliant position. In-group preferences, colonial ideas of academic excellence. And if you're in a meeting with a group of staff trying to think of solutions, and you try and say that you want people to address all of these things down on the left, and then someone else pipes up with, why don't we just set up a mentoring program, raise their confidence, raise their aspiration. This is incredibly appealing. You can see immediately how you do it. You can probably think how much budget it would cost. It's done with very, very little inconvenience to anyone. But you're achieving very little in and of itself. I want to bring this in just because I think it's a brilliant piece of research. Dr. Nicola Rollock interviewed 20 of the then 25 Black women professors in the UK. And this led to the Phenomenal Women Portraits of UK Black Female Professors. And when you look at some of the, these are only some of the portraits, but when you look at these women, I don't think any of them lack aspiration. I don't think any of them lack confidence. And when you read the research into their coping strategies, it was about having to pick battles, having to be strategic. It was about resilience and having to overcome everyday racism and slights. So we really do need to stop thinking about quick fixes and start running the marathon. I like this tweet from Ronke Lawal. Sometimes I don't want a seat at the table, not because I feel like an imposter, but because the table and chair are dusty, unfriendly and unwelcoming. And sometimes I don't want to always have to build my own seat or table because I'm exhausted from having to work twice as hard. So going forward, what can we do? Just after the statue of Colston was toppled in Bristol, Omar Khan, who was then the director of Runnymede Trust, tweeted this. I'm a policy and research person who spent years in the UK trying with argument and evidence to make the case to tackle racial inequalities. It's plausible that protesters have achieved more in terms of public understanding of race in 2 days than I did in 21 years. And anyone that works in EDI, I think, can appreciate that and feel a certain level of sympathy to that tweet. He goes on to say, of course, we still need the evidence, we need the data, we need the policy, we need the research. But we need to think about how we can keep a sustained attack. So we need a sustained and continual pressure on universities, on senior management teams from different sources. We definitely need grassroots activism. We need direct action. And I think the students at Goldsmith demonstrate that direct action can work. We need policy and research. But we also need senior allies and white allies. And I take Deborah's point that white people can't lead this, but white allyship has to be part of it. We need everyone asking the questions constantly and making it incredibly difficult for universities not to get involved with this and actually to start investing in this work and moving things forward. I was thinking about this from a football perspective, if there's any football fans there, that when asked about Raheem Sterling's comments about white privilege in football and football's ability to go into management positions, Frank Lampard replied, Raheem Sterling had some fantastic points about race, but I think he got it wrong when it came down to his comments about management, because suddenly it impacted on Frank Lampard. Frank Lampard as a person was being asked to think about his white privilege and he didn't like it. And so he suddenly just got rid of it. He didn't want to engage in the debate. But how powerful would it have been if he, as a white man in a privileged position, had said, actually, I think he had a point. And yeah, we do need to start thinking about the structural and cultural basis for racism. And Robin DiAngelo, I think, talks about white fragility as well. thinking about it as a good-bad binary. White people still see racism as being caused by individuals who consciously and intentionally set out to do them harm. And we need to get rid of this binary thinking and start thinking about how all of us play a part across the spectrum. So in terms of moving forward, we need to take a strategic approach. We need to stop taking a deficit approach, stop deficit thinking, and stop thinking about magic wand solutions. There isn't a magic wand solution. We need to acknowledge the scale of the issues and think about the covert as well as the overt and start calling out microaggressions. We need full sector-wide accountability mechanisms. Paulette mentioned the gap between research councils, universities, and I would say learned societies and other bodies as well. Who's responsible for different aspects of this? We need full sector-wide accountability, getting rid of benchmarking, and thinking about university level, departmental and faculty level, and individual level accountabilities. We need senior leaders to do their homework. It's not enough to sign off a statement to say that you're completely in favour of race equity. You need to start putting your money where your mouth is and actually upskilling yourself on this. We need to reward and acknowledge those who do this work on top of their day job as well. And I'm guessing that's probably the majority of the speakers from this afternoon. People are doing this on top of everything else they do, and it's just not fair, it's not rewarded, and we need to move away from that. And we need action, action, action. We need conscious inclusion, starting with an imagery audit. I mean, that research into the NHS website is just shocking, isn't it? That many pages without a single person of colour on them. We need conscious inclusion. This isn't going to happen by accident. We need to think about recruitment and selection, stopping the tap on the shoulder and start going out and finding people that can help the organisation. We need allyship and white privilege training. We need to review promotions processes and also what gets rewarded and start thinking about properly rewarding citizenship contributions as well. We need to think about sponsorship, opening the figurative door for people, making sure that people can be networked and get the same opportunities as their white counterparts. We need to empower and support staff networks and decolonise teaching and learning. And actually that should be teaching, learning and research. My mum always says, where there's a will, there's a way. And I truly believe that there is. I think we know the way. This afternoon has come up with so many ideas, so many actions have come out of this afternoon. There is a way. What we need is the will. And we all need to keep badgering universities and keep pressing and pushing to ensure that there is a will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for your presentation, and thank you for using your position and your own privilege to really make changes in regards to racial equity. And I do think you're right. Senior managers and senior leaders do need to, start calling out their peers and really making sure that there's critical change made from the top. They need to lead by example and really walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Racism is systemic, so the work of racial equity needs to be systemic as well. So thank you very much, all presenters. Thank you for the audience. I just want to say thank you for such an epic and pivotal and deep symposium. I'm sure the audience will agree that we have a lot of new knowledge to take back to our institutions so that we can begin the work immediately to dismantle oppressive systems and processes that are othering and create disadvantage in opportunities and outcomes for Black students and staff. I would like to say thank you to the events team who supported me with just a week's notice, despite having to organise virtual graduation ceremonies this week, and to AV, and also to my student advocate, Hile, who agreed to help me moderate the chat and QA today. Thank you to the audience for showing up to make a stand against systemic racism. This has been Brunel University London Student Success Projects, Dismantling Hegemonies and Anti-Blackness in Higher Education. I have been Abigail Elliott, so I'd like to say take care and dismantle with love and righteous rage. Thank you.